So yeah, hi everyone. Welcome to this webinar today. I'm Carla. I'm a growth marketing manager at Briink, and I will be introducing today's session by sharing some housekeeping rules with you. And then I will hand it over to our panelists and to Benjamin, our moderator, for a very interesting panel discussion. As you know, today's topic is all about supply chain ESG data collection, how you can actually improve your ESG data collection practices and processes by harnessing technology on one side, such as generative AI and emission data collection technology, and also by sort of weaving ESG considerations into your supply chain data collection or due diligence strategy. And I wanted to move on actually to introducing our speakers. Today we have a quite interesting panel combining perspective from, let's say, the corporate side of ESG data collection and the technology side, especially when it comes to emission data collection technology, and of course, artificial intelligence, and specifically generative AI for social and governance data collection and generally ESG data collection. And so our speakers today are Ampy Aswin, Sylwia Bodzon, and Benjamin Howard Cooper, who, as I mentioned, will be moderating. So yeah, I guess, Ampy, if you want to start by introducing yourself and telling a bit about who you are and yeah, why you are, let's say, interested in this topic.
Thank you, Carla. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone from Singapore. I am Ampy Aswin, and it's a pleasure to be here in this timely and relevant topic of ESG data collection. My background is in supply chain with over 25 years of end-to-end global supply chain experience in Unilever and Google, especially across Asia Pacific. I'm passionate in reimagining sustainable value chains and helping organizations solve transformation challenges to unlock new levers of business value and growth. I'm currently involved as a board director in a nonprofit organization called Preferred by Nature. They are dedicated to supporting better land management and business practices that benefit people, nature, and the climate across 100+ countries. Pleasure to be here and looking forward to an engaging discussion with everyone.
Thank you, Ampy. Really nice having you here. And now I will hand it over to our next speaker, Sylwia.
Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here. My name is Sylwia Bodzon. I'm a climate impact advisor at EIVEE. My career has been maybe quite unusual, leading to sustainability. Majority of my international career has been in business aviation industry. But about 3 years ago, I decided I really want to do something that aligns with my values more and something that helps the climate. And that's what brought me to EIVEE. And I'm really passionate, and we are really passionate at EIVEE about helping customers collect and standardize the data so that they can be successful in their ESG strategies and achieving their targets. Really excited about today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylwia. We're really excited about hearing a bit more about EIVEE, I think later in the discussion as well. So, I mean, stay tuned for that. And then last but absolutely not least, Ben, do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Of course. Thank you, Carla. Thank you to everyone for joining today. And thank you to my esteemed panelists. Really excited to have a thought-provoking conversation with everyone here today. I have a background in sustainability reporting and ESG data collection, working across a number of different functions in government and financial services, and currently serve as the head of sustainable finance at Briink, where we are building AI native technologies to support ESG analytical workflows centered around providing solutions for knowledge sharing around the complex and evolving world of ESG regulations and frameworks, as well as supporting with various tasks along the ESG analytical workflow. And today's conversation is really intended to be a pragmatic and industry-based approach. We'll try and stay away from theory and really focus on delivering real-world solutions and real-world insights around this very complex topic of ESG data collection, particularly with a focus around supply chain. In recent years, there's been an increasing focus across various sectors and geographies around ESG data collection in supply chains. While ESG conversations were predominantly around sort of endogenous company level metrics, in recent years, there's been an increasing focus on supply chains and how those impact overall ESG metrics for corporations. And so today, really stay focused on this new and emerging and also very complex part of the analysis. Certainly there will be questions and potentially even feedback throughout the call. So as Carla mentioned, please do send those over in the chat and we'll make sure that we raise those. Anything that we aren't able to address on today's call, we can also handle through follow-ups later on. But with that, let's jump right in. And, I wanted to direct maybe my first question to Ampy, and starting with maybe sort of a framing question. In your perspective, what are the main challenges that companies are facing when collecting ESG data from their suppliers?
Okay, thanks, Benjamin, for that question. I think I'll pause and talk about, there's three distinct components in ESG, the E, the S, and G. And those are very, very different. So you have the more quantitative element of environmental measures, which covers your carbon emissions, waste, and water management collection. S and G are more the non-tangibles, looking for elements that measures your social license to operate. Governance, looking at how your board governance structure is. So very distinct elements, and there are challenges across it because of the distinct elements that are being measured on each of these. Let me just try to classify the challenges on three buckets. The first one would be on the data complexity and quality. There are multiple sources that you're needing in collecting the data. So fragmented data that you need to integrate. And the way different organizations are measuring, and there are different frameworks available, there are different rulers in measuring. And therefore, it's very difficult to integrate if you're having a different ruler as a starting point, leading to a lot of inconsistencies. Different standards used by both customers and suppliers. The other element is that within the data, because it's voluntary in nature, tends to be incomplete. And because it's voluntary, you also want to make sure that you can verify the information that you are collecting. A lot of that is dependent on voluntary information. Data is also compromised because of the wide scope of the value chain and the interdependence of it. So that's the first one. So data complexity and quality. The second element touches on the S and the G part, which is the subjectivity in social metrics. So a lot of the measures are looking at employee satisfaction, diversity and inclusion, community impact, that are qualitative and can be very subjective in nature. So there may be biases in what is being reported. The other element that we also need to be mindful of when you're looking at social metrics is that it can also raise privacy and ethical concerns in the collection. So biases in data collection, privacy element are things that you need to be mindful of in the social metrics that you're measuring. And the third element, I would say, is the reporting and changing regulatory landscape. So there's huge volume and velocity of the data that are being managed. And this sheer volume can easily overwhelm an organization's data management system. So managing large data sets, needing to make meaningful analysis and deriving actionable insights requires substantial technical and analytical capabilities. The other element is the timeliness of the reporting, backed by accuracy and completeness of data, is also a challenge in an evolving regulatory landscape. So in summary, data complexity and quality, subjectivity in social metrics, and the last one on reporting and changing regulatory landscape.
No, thanks, Ampy. All of those certainly resonate with me and what I hear working with our clients across our geographies and sectors. And maybe one thing to add that's a pain point that I hear quite often is engaging with some of the smaller firms in the supply chain. When you're working with the larger corporations that may have robust ESG data management systems and ESG teams to do that data management, it's a little bit of an easier situation than when you're working with smaller firms that simply do not have the capacity or resources to do some of this very intensive work. And so one thing that we see quite often is, it really starts with doing education and sensitization to some of these companies around why these data points are being requested, supporting them on collecting those data points so that the larger entity can perform their own reporting techniques. So no, I think certainly a lot of pain points to be felt across. Sylwia, did you have any sort of high level views on the pain points for ESG data collection at supplier level?
I definitely agree with Ampy on the data complexity. I mean, I agree on both, but data complexity and the landscape of that is really a major challenge. If we think about environmental footprint of companies and how we measure that today, we basically use a lot of systems and tools that were not really designed for that purpose. And I'm talking about when we talk about Scope 3 emission mapping, spend-based approach is an approved approach by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, not the most granular, not the most accurate, but sometimes it is the best alternative to doing nothing. And then we talk about, your financial systems, your tools for procurement, operational excellence systems. So all those tools that were not really designed with carbon emissions reporting when they were put in place. So that's a major struggle that I feel like a lot of companies are underestimating. So when we finally sit down with a client and look at their data landscape, it really starts to unfold how much complexity and how much work will go into standardizing all of that input data. So huge challenge there. And then, of course, once we map the data, then there is the output data quality and having to adhere to so many different standards, right? So it's kind of twofold, the input data complexity and then adhering to several standards. One thing I would add as a challenge, maybe it's a little bit provocative, a little bit controversial, but I do speak to a lot of sustainability professionals out there every day. And what I see is that sustainability has become such a highly prioritized point on the strategic agenda. If you go to any website of a respected company today, you will see sustainability front and center probably. So it's, I would say, in top 3, top 5 strategic pursuits of most companies out there. But then when you ask a question, is it also in your top 3 or top 5 budget allocations? The answer usually is no, right? And why it matters? Because of that complexity, because of so much work that has to go into proper reporting. We see a lot of sustainability professionals being left with no support and no help to really deliver on those targets that are dictated by the board or by the senior leadership. So a lot of frustration and people leave. People decide to move on from those positions because they are not well equipped to really deliver. And I think something that resonates with me personally as well, usually when you go into that sort of career, you decide to do that because it aligns with your values. You are really purpose-driven. You want to drive impact and drive reduction initiatives, feel like you're doing something that matters. But oftentimes what you end up doing is spending your time in Excel spreadsheets and not having a lot of support to really drive that forward. So I think that's also an important point that I see in the future. It will become easier, and I think that attention and talking about this, it's really important because it brings the attention to that issue as well.
No, I think
that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, you made a very important point in how to embed that. You have to embed it in existing processes, your procurement processes, your financial processes. This is not an add-on, and that is how you will be able to really make sure that it's embedded in your business processes and institutionalized.
Absolutely, yeah.
Maybe a follow-up question to both. Have you seen any best practices around how organizations can effectively implement this in their existing processes, how there can be better management buy-in to invest in some of these, what can be expensive, but also necessary data management tools?
What you typically see, Ben, is the ones who made a public commitment. So they need to invest. So that's where the bigger drive is. I haven't really seen someone, because you need to have a very clear picture of what your, and the reporting comes afterwards. You need to make sure what is it that you are disclosing, what is it that you're going to be setting as a goal, and this comes afterwards. So that one you have immediate buy-in. The other one, I would say the push factor is there is a regulatory requirement. You need it for reporting purposes. You need it for your financial reporting purposes. Those are, at this stage, the bigger push in adopting certain database management tools.
Mm-hmm. No, and it resonates with what I see in the market as well. You know, when the ESG reporting world, I think, Ampy, as you said, is more of a bolt-on, more of an afterthought. It becomes more of a cost center. But when ESG data is really centered around organizational performance, then it becomes a value additive part of the business. It helps provide more insights into performance, into trends, into future needs and requirements. And so, yeah, really the deep embedding of ESG across organizational data is really critical from what we've seen.
But one bright spot, Ben, on that is that there's a lot of post-COVID, there's a lot of fragility exposed in supply chain. And therefore, supply chain practitioners are looking for risk management tools.
Yeah.
ESG actually provides that. So it's an element for you to measure your extended value chain risk element. So it's not a separate one, but it's one of the things that you're looking at on managing the risk factor of your extended value chain.
Mm-hmm. Let's explore some of these issues through a concrete ESG metric. And I think on the top of many practitioners' mind is Scope 3. I think it touches on a lot of the complexities that both Sylwia and Ampy have raised in their remarks through this conversation. And maybe, Sylwia, starting with you, curious about sort of your perspective around some of the primary challenges with Scope 3 emissions in particular. I know we've talked about the ruler, we've talked about the complexity of engaging with some smaller firms, but maybe deep diving specifically around Scope 3, you know, what do you see as the main issues? And maybe a follow-up to that is, do you see any quick wins that companies can achieve when trying to gather this data?
Right. Thank you for that question. So Scope 3 in nature is quite outside of companies' control. It's much more indirect than your Scope 1 and 2. So if we think about category 3.1, which is your purchase goods and services, that means you are going to be reporting on your suppliers' emissions, right? So how do I, first of all, get that data from my suppliers, and how do I incentivize them to actually start to do their own reporting? A lot of them, and as you mentioned before as well, smaller companies don't really seem to have that incentive and don't really seem to have the necessary support in the form of trainings, really enforcing doing the right thing towards reporting. So definitely lack of control, or maybe less control than on your Scope 1 and 2, makes it really, really challenging. And then when it comes to methodology that allows you to map your Scope 3 emissions, as I mentioned, there is the spend-based methodology, which basically takes your financial data and we would map it with emission factors. And that's another challenge here. Emission factors availability also tends to be a challenge depending on the industry. So there is a couple of things to consider there as well. Spend-based approach is a good way to start, but you definitely want to evolve the data quality over time and include more of your activity averages. So really adding metrics, adding not only relying on your financial data, but adding to that your kilowatts, hours, kilometers, kilograms, basically to specify the actual impact. And then over time, what you really want to do is to incorporate more of your supplier input data, either supplier intensity or even product intensity. So having specific LCAs on your suppliers' products or EPDs, more granular data will also allow you to make better decisions, because that's also something that I feel like oftentimes is overlooked a little bit. Why do we need to go so granular? Why do we need to categorize our spend so much in detail? It should be just good enough to do it, on category 1. But in fact, if you don't do it as granular as you should, you might be overlooking, you might be missing some of the insights required for decision making. So that is an important factor in why we should do it more granularly, but it is definitely more challenging. So yeah, bringing it basically the indirect nature of scope 3, big challenge. Emission factors in many industries, some industries are not as defined. It's still a bit of a gray area. And the methodology, evolution of your data quality and tracking that over time to be able to demonstrate and see more, get more insights into your data.
Yeah, and it's a pain point that I hear, or a fear that I hear quite often. I think there is so much focus on these reported ESG metrics, and there's a real fear of greenwashing. And I think when we're in this evolving methodological world where the ruler is changing and becoming more specific, restatements are inevitable. And so, how does an organization go out and report a scope 3 emissions number today based on the current methodology, based on more of a proxy data approach, and really work with good intent over time to make that more granular, but those numbers change. And I think it is a reflection that ESG is a journey and not a destination. This is an evolving world. There needs to be some sort of understanding that numbers will evolve over time, but what's really critical is a transparent approach towards describing the methodology. Not just going out and saying our scope 3 emissions are X, but explaining how did you get to that scope 3 emissions number. And in future years, as you get better at reporting, making it clear, this is how these numbers have changed. This is why they've changed. I say that the best reporting has, more pages of footnotes than of actual reporting, because they actually spend that time to go into it. But I think, particularly in the next couple of years, as this evolves more, as there's better technology solutions in place, we'll continue to see these restatements.
I think one thing to add, barriers to full disclosure is that there are organizations that feel that they may be penalized by showing their real emission factors. And that's a dilemma. Full disclosure, full reporting, and at the same time, getting penalized for being transparent. And that's still a challenge. And unless we are encouraging that this is a journey and we're not penalizing people for reporting. So once you have regulation, then that will change the picture. But the fact that people are looking at it closely and it's not yet regulated, people are very selective on what they disclose.
A great transition to the next question I wanted to ask. And I think particularly in the context of Europe, where implementation of the EU Sustainable Finance Package and particularly the CSRD is creating a flood of data, some of which will be audited, which will address some of the issues that Ampy raised earlier on. Sylwia, maybe starting with you, curious how you see some of these new regulatory regimes changing the game around scope 3 emissions or really any other supplier data.
Right, yeah. I think the biggest game changer when it comes to CSRD is double materiality. So basically now we're going to be looking at sustainability and financial performance and financial data more on an equal level of importance. And double materiality means basically companies will be required to assess their impact on the climate and the environment. So scope 1, 2, and 3, LCAs, all of that good stuff, but also the impact of the climate on their own operations, on their business. So really taking that approach, that kind of twofold, looking at it from both lenses, which I think will enforce much more accurate ways of looking at your sustainability strategies and how we can execute, so we can both advance and go forward and avoid any or mitigate risks on that journey. So having that more structured and really articulated in CSRD, I think it's a big step forward. Standardization, as you mentioned, Ben, I think that will also increase the level of or the ability to compare performances a little bit better, because today, and that's also what I hear from customers that we work with, you know, they want to do the good thing, they want to do the right thing to calculate their performance, to calculate the emissions per product, but then there is competition who might be using different methodologies, might be omitting, might be using different boundaries. And back to your point about transparency and methodology, that's really key there, because two different companies producing very similar products might come to very different emission numbers, because they might be using different approaches or lacking data and not really being transparent about it. And what ends up happening is that the company that might have a lower footprint but really might not have been covering the entire footprint or using the right approach might win the contract, or might win the bid because of their imperfect approach to sustainability or to reporting. So I think the standardization, third-party assurance audits, having that audit-ready data quality, really important, and double materiality, in my view, definitely a game changer.
Great. I think, Ampy, I'm really curious to hear your regional perspective. We talk about these regulations as being very EU focused, but, anybody who wants to deal with the EU is also being touched by these regulations, and curious, your view on that.
Absolutely. So what happens in EU doesn't stay in EU only, because there's a lot of suppliers coming from Asia Pacific getting into EU, and they have to comply with the standards that has been set in EU. So it's not yet as mature if I look at Asia Pacific when it comes to regulation, but I would say that it is not shielded from what's happening in Europe, because it's interdependent. When you're looking at global supply chains, it's connected. And therefore, there are already movements to make sure that organizations here are compliant because they are exporting their goods into Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe transitioning away from some of these harder quantitative metrics into some of the S&G, the social and governance perspectives that are also part of this ESG data collection process. Ampy, curious to hear a little bit more on your perspective around social and governance policies. You mentioned that one of the issues was that it's highly qualitative, that one person's view on a policy or approach could be quite different from another. Maybe a supplier has a very good policy on paper, but how do you actually see how that's brought to life? Curious on your insights around how to really assess and manage some of the social and governance policy assessment.
There's two elements there. You mentioned one, which is a lot of it in paper. And since these are all risk related, so the first assurance that organizations would do is to ensure suppliers abide by its supplier code of conduct, governed by legal and contractual measures on paper. So you sign, for you to be a qualified supplier, you sign a supplier code of conduct that you will be complying to a certain set of expectation that the customers have put forward to adhere as conditions of doing business, with clear clauses of consequences of non-compliance. But that's just on paper. The reality is whatever happens, it is still part of your value chain. And therefore, there is a lot of supplier audits depending on the risk factor, the level of third-party regular supplier audits and assessments to evaluate compliance to certain ESG guidelines that the organization set forth. This can involve on-site visits, third-party audits, evaluations of their ESG performance against agreed-upon metrics, reporting processes requiring suppliers to disclose at a regular basis their ESG data and information, environmental impact data, labor practices, human rights record. Again, depending on the risk factor, you may have it with a third-party audit, and some may just be an internal audit. And then going beyond, you mentioned this earlier, because not all suppliers, and typically this is your tier 2 suppliers who are not as advanced. Then you have a different level of engagement. There is more collaboration and training that is required to increase their capacity. And there's collaboration with suppliers to jointly address the ESG challenges, because they're part of your value chain. So it's not just about measuring your risk, but also mitigating the risk. And so it's a multifaceted approach that combines compliance requirements, engagement, collaboration, capacity building to ensure that suppliers meet the ESG guidelines and contribute to sustainable and responsible value chains.
No, and I think a really sort of metrics-based way to look at some of these issues is look at ESG ratings, and particularly when it comes to social and governance factors. The divergence that different agencies have when they look at some of this scoring really speaks to the subjective nature and methodology of assessing some of these. It's one of the reasons why at Briink we're building technology to really standardize the way that you do some of this social and governance assessment, taking a more technology-based approach, so that one analyst looking at a human rights policy at a firm doesn't walk away with a very different set of assumptions than another analyst looking at those same topics. And I think this approach towards technology is probably going to be the thing that helps facilitate all of this data collection. I know the first 30 minutes of this webinar have seemed a little bit doom and gloom. Everything is bad, everything is tough, but I think my perspective is that there is help on the way. There are new solutions that are entering the market that can really help in some of this, not only data collection, but standardizing the way that we look at some of the data. And maybe that's my next question that I wanted to ask here for Sylwia. What technology innovations are you most excited about when it comes to GHG data collection?
Well, I hope that my job soon will be replaced by AI, so companies will be able to navigate their journeys better and be better equipped with proactive insights as to what data is required, how do we adhere to different regulations, and it's starting to happen with AI technology, and also using the data that we start to collect large amounts of data that allow us to build intelligent models to help support those journeys and to help support those teams that are up against that challenge. So definitely having more of a let's say a sustainability advisor in the form of AI to really proactively equip you and help you engage with your data and standardize your data. Another interesting development, which I'm hoping to see, and again, it is starting to pick up, gathering live data. So for some businesses, we are now at the stage where they are just starting their journey. So this sounds really futuristic, but there are more advanced companies, usually larger companies or companies in specific industries that are looking at measuring live data by either use of smart meters and being very, very specific and granular in the reporting. So one example, a very inspiring company here in Scandinavia, who is about to be producing green steel, so reducing 95% of steel emissions by using sustainable modes of production. Every ton of steel emits 2 tons of CO2. So this is really huge, and they are going to be reducing that by 95%. Their business model is very much based on the ability to map specific emissions to each roll of steel or each coil of steel that they sell. So basically having a QR code that the client can scan and see exactly what went into producing that specific roll of steel. So we are talking about defining more levels of data quality and data granularity, where the last level is really taking live data from smart meters installed at the factory side and really feeding that data into your integrated systems. So all of that will require also a lot of integrations of several systems. And as we spoke about before, a lot of the existing tools will have to be utilized. But on top of that, adding more data sources, maybe satellite monitoring or drone or data based on drone technology as well, to really give you real-time insights and real-time data. Yeah, basically. So that's I would say two things that I'm most excited about, and I'm also really excited to start seeing it happen, right? So it's really happening, and some of the companies are really ahead of the game when it comes to that, and they are really thinking in a future forward way, which is great to see.
Yeah, I think it comes back to a point that you raised earlier on the call. You've got companies who will talk the talk. They'll say we care about sustainability, we care about our ESG performance, but then when you look at spend, it's not really there. And this is an expensive thing to do if not done properly. You don't want to just hire a new army of analysts who are coming in and tracking these very granular data points. So, figuring out how do you use technology to do a lot of that legwork is really critical. And in my view, what's going to separate the winners from the losers here, because if you're doing this very expensive manual-based approach, it's rife with errors. Humans make mistakes, maybe more so than artificial intelligence, and it is very expensive. And I was curious, Ampy, your views on technology and how this all plays together.
Yeah. So very similar. So NLP, generative AI. So the ability to ingest structured and unstructured data from external news articles and social media to do sentiment analysis is very crucial, especially in the social and governance part. So AI's ability to collect and aggregate information more effectively and automate tasks such as filtering and analytics, the legwork of it, will allow people to spend more time on addressing the issue, really looking at where the problem areas are, rather than spending time on the whole collection process. The other one, which Sylwia has mentioned, is the use of satellite imagery. So use of geospatial analytics, so enhanced satellite imagery, providing indirect input, so giving a powerful snapshot of the physical world, especially for those who are looking at deforestation issues. So this has been a very important technology input to give you a more holistic picture of what's happening. So there are a lot of additional indirect capture, so drones, satellite images, that help supplement and give you a fuller picture of what's happening in your value chain.
Yeah. No, and I think AI and natural language processing in general is so well positioned to support ESG workflows, given that all of this data is unstructured. It's very different from financial data, which lives in very standardized accounting rules-based templates. ESG data lives across PDFs, PowerPoints, Excels, within these broad EHS systems. And this is what these technologies are designed to do, is really capture this unstructured data and present it back in a way that is digestible and manageable for teams to really take action out of. And so, when we think about these technology implementations, NLP, everyone's talking about ChatGPT, but there's such an exciting use case, particularly around ESG, given sort of the deluge of regulatory requirements, of stakeholder requirements, and the type of data that exists. I think there's just so many exciting applications of these technologies. And, again, it comes back to not only cost savings, but efficiency. And really excited to see how this continues to evolve over the next couple of years.
I agree. And if I may add just one comment to that, with the technology getting more and more advanced and getting us data insights faster in a more automatic way, more accurate, granular way, people who work on those projects, those topics, who are really passionate about driving change, can actually focus their attention on reduction initiatives and driving action, really focusing on action rather than focusing on the data collection and all of those more manual tasks that also don't tend to be very rewarding in nature, right? So having that data at your fingertips to be able to drive change and drive impact, really important.
Great. Well, I've been hogging all the questions, and I see quite a number of them coming through the audience. Maybe wanted to open up to the audience questions that have been flowing in. If anybody has anything to add, please feel free to put those in the Q&A now, but want to maybe turn it over to Carla, who can direct some of those questions towards us.
Yes, Ben, indeed, there are many questions in the chat. I don't know if we will have time to reply to all of them in this webinar, but if there are, as I was saying, if there is any outstanding question, hopefully we can pick up contact with you if you didn't send the question anonymously in the Q&A. So actually the first question, which I think is really interesting, and I would like to ask that to you, Ben, because I know that's a topic we have worked a lot with at Briink, is around the CSRD, which is a huge topic right now. And as Ampy was mentioning, there are a lot of voluntary disclosures, but especially in the EU, now the CSRD is sort of transitioning those disclosure requirements to a more mandatory disclosure sphere. And the question is around how this will impact small and medium enterprises, right? The smaller companies, and I guess also the ones that are not necessarily EU-based, and what can they do to live up to these requirements more easily?
Technology. And I think particularly AI technologies are going to be part of the solution towards allowing these SMEs to live up to their regulatory requirements. I also think it's important to keep an eye on regulatory timelines. SMEs are indeed impacted by the CSRD and the ESRS data collection in the out years. What's going to separate winners from losers here are the SMEs who really start to embed some of these data collection and reporting processes today. I think waiting until the year before your regulatory requirements come into place is a recipe for disaster. We've seen sort of the issue around restatements, the sort of greenwashing risks that come up there. So I think it's really critical for SMEs, if they aren't already thinking about integrating ESG metric collection as part of their normal processes around procurement and HR, start doing that today, because it's going to be a heavy investment. And if you just do the bolt-on that Ampy was talking about at the start of this call, it's just going to be expensive, and you're not going to be able to derive any real actionable insights from that. ESG data is going to help you make forward-looking decisions as a firm. Without ESG data, you have a blind spot in your operations. You don't see where the risks are coming from. You don't see where the opportunities are in relation to some of these very big topics. So I think it's critical for SMEs to maybe take a step back, not freak out too much about the imposing regulatory regimes, and really see this as an opportunity to enhance their own business operations. And again, to do it effectively. This doesn't mean hiring an army of analysts to go and collect granular data. It means thinking about, what type of data do I currently have? And critically, what do I need to report on? Materiality is critical to all of these regimes. If you are talking about a 5-person startup, is it really important to build out a robust Scope 3 emissions calculation? Probably not. Really think about, what does my business do? What are the risks I face? And what is my impact to my shared environment? Focus on those metrics first, because that will really help give you a North Star towards building out these regimes.
Thank you, Ben. That's, I think, very, very interesting, and also weaves into some of the other questions that we received. There were some questions around materiality that were maybe a bit more specific, but maybe we will take them offline in a way. And I actually have another question which speaks more to Sylwia's point that she just had right before the Q&A. So you were mentioning there is this big kind of gap between execution and measurement. And Eskild asked in the chat, how do you actually get things done? Like, after you measured your data, are there any, let's say, best practices to, after you brought those measurements to the board level, to actually get them executed at a wider company level? Are there any things that you experienced by working with clients that you know of?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is to get the attention first, and to kind of sell it internally and build a business case for sustainability. That's where I see a lot of the challenges happening. Once you get up and running, and once you have a certain setup for measuring your emissions, targets, initiatives implemented, it really comes down to delivering and working towards achieving those objectives, and then also demonstrating, keeping in mind, how did we initially sell this internally? Because the truth is that businesses, especially now in the current economical landscape, financial performance is key, and it's tough out there, right? So they really want to make sure that what we are doing on the ESG front really pays off. So that could mean, and this is very individual to each company. How do we measure success, both in terms of reducing emissions, but how does it impact our employee retention? How does it impact our commercial success and capturing new customer segments or market expansion, entering new markets? So there's a lot of metrics that and a lot of aspects, KPIs that could be incorporated. And I think it's both an opportunity and a challenge to define those KPIs, because it is maybe in the environmental aspect, it's a little bit easier. The social aspect, I think it's even might be even more challenging in certain ways to be very quantitative. So I guess my last point here would be education of your leadership and really sharing knowledge and sharing that perspective so they can understand and they can stand behind the strategy and the execution because they get it, that they have the required depth of understanding to really support it long term, and then adjust also if needed to. So it is about transparency in your communication, setting objectives, mutual understanding, engaging stakeholders internally and externally as well. Yeah.
So if I hear you correctly, it's about really explaining to all the stakeholders why this is relevant for you too, for your department too, and not just some fuzzy ESG or sustainability metric. It has implications for all the business.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great, thank you. That's a very interesting point. Ampy, I also have a question for you based on your, let's say, experience actually dealing with these topics in corporations. There was this question about the trade-offs when it comes to Scope 3 emissions, but maybe we can talk about emission data in general, between using estimates, so proxy data, and actually requiring the data from suppliers. When do you think either of these approach is more suitable in a way? Are there any things, let's say, experiences that you want to share there?
It goes back to the materiality impact. So especially if you have a public disclosure of a target that you've already set forth that you will be achieving, you need to make sure, and typically it's your bigger suppliers that needs to work with you collaboratively. And it depends on the industry. What is it that you're looking at? The tech industry would be more on the energy aspect of it. If you're in the food sector, you're really looking at your sustainable agriculture. So you need to understand what is material for your company and make sure you measure that. But then you also have a huge range of suppliers where you cannot absolutely do the same level of rigor with your key suppliers. Then the more pragmatic thing to do would be to then use proxy. So proxy that organizations are using are the declarations of suppliers in CDP, for instance, as a proxy. And then you have verification based on what you're seeing as standard emission factors, just to give you a complete picture. But for those that you're measuring and you have publicly disclosed, there's a different level of rigor that is required in the data that you're collecting from your suppliers and the verification process as well.
And maybe just to add on that, I think when done correctly, ESG is a great engagement tool. And one metric that I've been seeing a lot in reporting recently isn't necessarily just around Scope 3 and supplier data, but what percentage of suppliers have a carbon emissions reduction strategy aligned with the SBTi. So there's also this idea of intentionality, and the larger corporations who have this institutional heft, who really can help lead the conversation, can engage with suppliers not only around data collection, but also around target setting. And I think that's a critical part of the conversation because, what exists today is important, but really how do you drive some of those metrics down is also critically important.
And we were just talking about this, Ben, earlier. So it's moving also beyond reporting. The ESG 2.0 is not just about identifying where your risk factors are, but addressing those risks. And this is the critical decade of climate action where you need to make sure that what you're doing is tangible and on the S&G aspect, that you are promoting a much more socially inclusive world for everyone.
And actually,
to add to that,
sorry.
sorry, Carla, just a quick comment actually on that note. I think what's really inspiring about this and what I see some of the companies doing, like IKEA, for example, their supplier engagement program is pretty advanced to the point where IKEA is using their negotiating power to negotiate energy contracts for their suppliers in their respective geographical areas to switch to renewable energy, right? So that way it's a win-win, because IKEA wants to reduce their emissions by reducing their suppliers' scope 1 and 2, scope 2 in that case. So it's really inspiring to see that movement and large companies taking that ownership and really supporting their suppliers. So it's really a partnership effort, which is great to see. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I wanted to say is one of the questions that actually speaks exactly to this point, and I think something that Ampy was also mentioning throughout the webinar, that considering these priorities, urgency that we have with climate policies and better ESG regulations, do you all, and I open this up to all of you, do you have any ideas on how to foster practically collaboration between different stakeholders in the ecosystem? So investors, companies, and other stakeholders, maybe also regulators, to improve, to create really an ecosystem and improve practices, not just at the company level, but at a larger level. Maybe this is too broad, but I just wanted to hear if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it comes down to practicality and being pragmatic. I think as long as ESG reporting is the domain of the compliance officer and isn't embedded across all of the organizational performance assessments, then it isn't so effective. And I think when industry comes together with the investment community, with regulators, and talks about what is materially happening in businesses, that's how you get to the best policy outcomes. When regulators create policy on their own in a bubble, you get this distortion in the market. When investors are in charge of setting what they want without any sort of input from business around the practicalities, or with regulators sort of setting the tone on what is necessary to move towards some of these global goals, you also have a market distortion. And so it needs to be a collaborative conversation that is really rooted in pragmatism. And I think how that manifests in the European context is around materiality. It's making sure that the conversations that are happening are really the important ones to have. And I think that's how you get to good collaboration.
Are there any other points on that? If not, we have 5 minutes left, and I actually wanted to mention another question that was relating to the, let's say, technology discussion that we were having before. So somebody was asking in the chat, okay, you spoke about technology, that's all very interesting, but what are some concrete examples of how you can use AI? And I mean, I think Ampy was already mentioning some interesting use cases, but I wanted to mention that, for example, we at Briink, we basically, the way we use AI, we use it for the extraction of unstructured data, exactly from documents such as PDFs or reports or any other types of, let's say, text documents in text form. And the way we use this is that basically you can filter out the data that is relevant to you, and you can also get references so that your analysts can kind of do that work much faster, right? Because we don't want people to be spending endless time in these documents. Just we're using Control F a lot, and not, as Sylwia was rightly mentioning, not using that time, allocated that time to actually driving, some actionable climate initiatives, climate-friendly initiatives. I don't know, Ben, if you had another point related to that, or you wanted to add something there.
Yeah, I would say some of the more exciting work that we've been launching at Briink over the last couple of months is really not just around sort of the data collection, but also the data analysis. And there are parts of the ESG analytical process that are critical towards driving value. I think both Sylwia and Ampy have really talked about how you can get rid of some of the manual rote activities and really focus on delivering real impact. one tool that we've recently launched at Briink is our ESG policy scanner, which is able to look at social policies of a company and do an OECD, MNE, and UNGC assessment. So the minimum safeguards or good governance under SFDR. And this, I think, speaks to Ampy's concerns around the subjectivity of some of these policies and trying to assess them, but also, going through a checklist of, does this policy say this? Does this policy say that? There's no value in that. That's really a pure reporting. The value comes through understanding, here's where the current policy is, and here's what needs to be changed, the gap analysis to get it into better alignment with some of these systems. It's doing some of the contextualization analysis on top of that, because, as we talked about in the beginning, the social policies of a small technology firm based in Germany should be very different than that of the Coca-Colas of the world. So you want to scale your assessment of some of these policies against the materiality. And AI technology is getting there, but human in the loop is still critical for some of that contextualization. And I think using AI to do some of that sort of standard work and then giving those efficiencies is really critical. Cool.
And maybe as we're coming to the end of the webinar, I have one last, let's say, provocative on I want to collect one last word from everybody on the panel. So I will actually use one of the questions that was sent in the chat as a discussion prompt. I would like to know, somebody asked, okay, I'm starting from zero. How do I get started? And the provocation is, can all of you share one key, let's say, best practice if you're really starting with this topic from zero? What is the one thing that you think people should think about? Yeah, take your time to think. I don't know who wants to maybe start, or if I should just call out a name.
Yeah, I can start, Carla. It's, again, back to materiality. It depends on what industry you're in. What is material for you? And start. You don't have to boil the ocean and collect everything. So if you're, say, in the example, I'll take Unilever as an example, where palm is a big part of it. They focus there. They focus on having the transparency and traceability of their palm value chain. In Google, it's about the energy, which is a very different, these are two different industries, and therefore their focus area are also very different. It's not about trying to do everything, but focus on what is material for your industry and start there.
I would say, if you're starting, make sure that whoever is in charge of operations owns ESG. I think you can tell a lot about how an organization approaches sustainability depending on who owns that organizational line. Particularly if you're just starting, the operations person should be in charge of ESG, because generally they're the ones overseeing general data and general technology processes, and making sure that they own that rather than the person who's interacting with investors, or rather than the strategy officer, I find generally leads to better results.
Sylwia, I guess it's up to you for the last key, let's say.
Yeah, I don't have much time left, so I do agree with both of you on those points. Yeah, essentially that's I think comes back to materiality, and a very good point, Ben, on who owns it, right? Is it the COO, or sometimes, or oftentimes, it is the CFO as well, in terms of the financial responsibility and reporting responsibility. So having those people in the loop and making sure that they are actually engaged. Yeah.
Great. And with that, we're actually, I believe, at the end of our conversation. I wanted to thank everybody again. Again, sorry, there are many questions that we didn't have any time to answer, but hopefully we can pick up, we can answer them offline separately. Yeah, and I just wanted to thank again everybody, also the attendees, for their interesting and very engaged participation in this webinar. And yes, thanks again, everybody, for your participation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.